Pope Francis creates a commission to streamline the marriage annulment process, just as a major meeting of the world's bishops on the family is set to begin in Rome. What could be coming? And we'll discuss the battle against ISIS with papal biographer and theologian George Weigel. Later, as religious faith wanes in some quarters, a lawyer examines the evidence for Christian belief and Christ himself. Political commentator, attorney, and author of Jesus on Trial, David LIMBAUGH, is here. And finally, in our Unseen Hero segment, a priest creates a new initiative to help the persecuted Christians of Iraq and Syria. Father BENEDICT KIELY will tell us what he's doing and how you can help. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. George Weigel, David LIMBAUGH, and Father BENEDICT KIELY are all straight ahead. If you have a question or comment during the show, send me a tweet at Raymond Arroyo. I'll be live tweeting throughout. Or drop us an email at worldover@EWTN.com. Let's get started. Lots to share with you. Here's the brief. News from the world over this week. The United States is again at war in the Middle East. Speaking at the United Nations General Assembly on Wednesday, President Barack Obama vowed to lead a coalition to dismantle the Islamic State. The president's remarks came as the U.S. expanded airstrikes against the Islamic State group in both Iraq and Syria. A coalition of 5 Arab nations joined the U.S. for the strikes in Syria, including Bahrain, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. It is the beginning of what the U.S. said would be a years-long battle to defeat ISIS. The president did stipulate that ultimately the U.S. cannot eliminate the threat of terrorism on its own.
Now, ultimately, the task of rejecting sectarianism and rejecting extremism is a generational task, and a task for the people of the Middle East themselves. No external power can bring about a transformation of hearts and minds.
More on ISIS in our next segment. And the first wave of airstrikes in Syria did not target ISIS alone. The U.S. announced it had struck at the command and control centers of an al-Qaeda-linked group known as Khorasan. According to military sources, the group was close to developing an explosive device undetectable to airport security. U.S. Lieutenant General William C. Mayville of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Effects of our strikes. But we've been watching this group closely for some time. We believe the Khorasan group was nearing the execution phase of an attack either in Europe or the homeland. We know that the Khorasan group has attempted to recruit Westerners to serve as operatives.
Meanwhile, ISIS has executed another Westerner, this time a Frenchman in Algeria. The Algerian splinter group of al-Qaeda has beheaded hostage Hervé Gourdel as a gruesome response to airstrikes on the Islamic State. A visibly upset French President François Hollande called the killing a cowardly assassination Wednesday at the United Nations General Assembly. He vowed to continue the military operation. This past Friday, France joined the U.S. in conducting airstrikes on the Islamic State in Iraq. 2 days later, Islamic State called on Muslims around the world to attack foreign targets. In Nigeria, there is growing concern over another jihadi group, Boko Haram, which we've been reporting on for years. Bishop Oliver Domi this week compared the savagery of Boko Haram to that of the Islamic State. He said the jihadists now control 25 towns in northeastern Nigeria. Bishop Domi is among thousands of refugees who fled their homes to evade the terrorists. He told the Nigerian daily This Day that most of the refugees in his area escaped being murdered, but many families were separated. Parents have lost children, and a humanitarian crisis is underway. Thousands, he said, are living in caves on the mountains, some in the forest. Thousands have managed to escape into Cameroon and are living under very difficult conditions. They lack food, shelter, and medication. A small spot of good news, and it's very small, after false rumors that the government had arranged the release of those schoolgirls kidnapped earlier this year, Boko Haram did release one schoolgirl. The girl appeared to be traumatized and suffering from a nervous breakdown. As world leaders gathered at the United Nations to discuss the Ebola crisis, U.S. health officials are warning that the epidemic in West Africa could explode to at least 1.4 million infected people by January. The Centers for Disease Control believes Ebola has infected more than 5,800 people in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Nigeria, and Senegal. Of those, 2,800 have died. Now, these are only the known cases. Back at the UN, Margaret Chan, director of the World Health Organization, offered her own grim assessment and implored world leaders to act.
We should expect things to get worse before getting better. People will continue to struggle for survival, and unfortunately, some will die. In a humane world, we cannot allow the people in West Africa to suffer so much. Excellencies, you hold the power to turn this horrific epidemic around, and I appeal to you to do more.
And in a bizarre story, Germany's Ethics Council is calling for the decriminalization of incest between adult siblings. In a 14-9 vote, the government panel opined, quote, "In the case of consensual incest among adult siblings, neither the fear of negative consequences for the family nor the possibility of the birth of children from such incestuous relationships can justify a criminal prohibition. The fundamental right of adult siblings to sexual self-determination has more weight than the abstract protection of the family," end quote. The council made the decision after examining a case involving a half-brother and sister who've had 4 children together. The brother, who is now serving a prison term for incest, was given up for adoption as an infant and apparently didn't meet his sister until their 20s. The Vatican has opened a criminal trial against its former ambassador to the Dominican Republic for the sexual abuse of minors. The former Archbishop Joseph Wesolowski was recalled by Pope Francis last year after allegedly paying boys to perform a sexual act. It is the first time a high-ranking Vatican official has faced criminal charges for abuse. He's been placed under house arrest due to an unnamed medical condition, according to the Vatican. The Church's canonical court found Wesolowski guilty of sexual abuse earlier this year and imposed the toughest penalty under canon law. He was stripped of his priestly faculties and laicized. Wesolowski could also face criminal charges in the Dominican Republic and in his native Poland. And a major U.S. appointment by Pope Francis, the Holy Father selected a new leader for the Archdiocese of Chicago, Spokane Bishop Blaise Cupich. He'll be replacing retiring Cardinal Francis George. The appointment to the premier archdiocese of the Midwest was surprising in so much as Bishop Cupich is the first non-archbishop to be named to the post in 99 years. Even he was surprised when the papal nuncio called to share the appointment.
Archbishop Vigano called me and began the conversation by saying, I have great news for you. And he sounded like the angel Gabriel, and so the line that came to me was, how can this be?
Cupich is generally viewed as a prelate who will defend church teaching when it's necessary, but prefers dialogue over confrontation. He will officially take over the diocese in November. We wish him the best in his new post, as well as Cardinal George, who's continuing a long bout with cancer. Our prayers are with both of them. And whenever a relatively unknown bishop comes to a new diocese, his record is scrutinized. Bishop Cupich is no exception. LifeSite News reported that just prior to the announcement in Chicago, Bishop Cupich was privately discouraging priests and seminarians in Spokane from taking part in abortion clinic prayer vigils during this year's 40 Days of Life campaign. It began on Wednesday. A statement from the diocese this past Friday clarified the bishop's position. It said that priests could participate, but should place emphasis on education and not confrontational tactics. He was also asked about the controversy at the by the Chicago media during his introduction.
I've always supported the rights of people to express themselves. I think that public manifestations of those sorts to express one's views in a peaceful way is very important. And I think we always have to look too at how we make sure that those are done that really produce something in the long run.
Liturgically, it's been reported that Bishop Cupich barred devotees of the traditional Latin Mass from celebrating the Easter Triduum liturgies when he was in Rapid City a decade ago. According to local reports, the faithful were literally locked out of the church in which they had celebrated the old rite for 12 years. At the time, Bishop Cupich said the decision was an invitation to unity in worship throughout the diocese. Also, while in Rapid City, the bishop decided to change the liturgical norm to a posture of standing throughout the communion rite of the Mass. His successor, Bishop Robert Gruss, changed the norm back to kneeling not long after his arrival. And talks between the Holy See and the breakaway traditionalist group, the Society of St. Pius X, have resumed. Cardinal Gerhard Mueller, the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei, which is charged with handling relations with SSPX, met this week with its superior, Bishop Bernard Fillet. The two-hour meeting was the first between the two sides since the Society rejected a 2012 Vatican proposal that would have brought the group into full communion with Rome. At issue, the group's adherence to certain church teachings and doctrinal matters that came out of Vatican II, including acceptance of the Novus Ordo Mass as legitimate. The Vatican said they will gradually overcome difficulties with a view to the envisioned full reconciliation. And it was announced this week that Pope Francis has created a special commission to study reforming the process of obtaining marriage annulments. According to the Vatican release, the Pope had directed the commission in August to focus on preparing a proposal for reforming the annulment process that would, quote, simplify and streamline the procedure while safeguarding the principle of the indissoluble nature of marriage. The Synod of Bishops on the family will gather in Rome next month to consider this issue, among others. The world over will be there in the lead-up to bring you full coverage of the event. And is the influence of religion waning in the public square? According to the Pew Research Center, Americans overwhelmingly say, yes, it is. Nearly 3/4 of those surveyed said religious influence in public life was dwindling, and most saw that as a negative trend. That's up 5 points from 2010. Among half of respondents said churches and houses of worship should speak out more on public issues. The same survey found that support for same-sex marriage has declined and no longer enjoys a majority of support. Regarding the Obama administration, just 30% of respondents agreed that the president was friendly toward religion. That's down 9% from 2009 and down 19% among Catholics and evangelicals. Is the Catholic Church reforming her teachings on marriage? And what of this new commission set up by Pope Francis to study the annulment process? Papal biographer and theologian George Weigel will give us his insights when The World Over Live continues. Stay with us.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. 2 weeks before the extraordinary Synod of Bishops on the family is to convene in Rome, the Vatican announced, as you heard, the formation of a special commission to study the marriage annulment process in the Catholic Church. Now, this has raised the stakes at the Synod, and even bolder proposals are now being floated. Also this week, the U.S. appears to be heading back to war in Iraq against the terrorist group ISIS. Does this pass the just war test? To sift through it all, we're joined by papal biographer and senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, our pal, George Weigel.
Hello,
Thanks
Raymond.
for being here.
Nice to be
I want to play a bite for you. This is the president at the UN this week, laying out the threat that faces the United States and trying to put ISIS in some context. Listen to this. I want your reaction.
We have reaffirmed again and again that the United States is not and never will be at war with Islam. Islam teaches peace. Muslims the world over aspire to live with dignity and a sense of justice. And when it comes to America and Islam, there is no us and them, there is only us, because millions of Muslim Americans are part of the fabric of our country.
Is what we are seeing in Iraq and Syria not part of the tradition of Islam?
What we're seeing in Iraq and Syria, and indeed all over the world, Raymond, is the playing out on a global stage of a civil war within Islam that has now burst out of that world to involve just about everybody else. The war is between those Muslims who want to find an Islamic path towards religious tolerance, political pluralism, and those who essentially
by whom, George?
Represented by, there are moderate Islamic scholars here in the United States. There are some states, Indonesia, Malaysia, some places that are slowly and with some difficulty moving in this direction. Senegal might be another example. And those who wish to recreate the 8th century Arabic world. And that's really what you've got in ISIS or ISIL, or as I call it, the Caliphate, since that's what they claim they wish to recreate. You've got some of the, you've got 8th century, 7th century minds with 21st century weapons, which unfortunately they got from us because of the extraordinary default in responsibility of the present administration in abandoning an effort that was on the verge of success in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that abandonment has now created an even more dangerous situation.
And that abandonment was what? Pulling the troops out, not training them completely?
Failing to understand, failing to explain to the American people that this was something like Korea. This was something where we were going to have to be there, not perhaps in large numbers, but in sufficient numbers, to create the security environment in which something resembling civil society could take hold. And out of that civil society could come a more decent politics. Now, why we can't name these things for what they are has been a mystery ever since 9/11, and indeed before 9/11. But until we begin to name them for what they are, we're not going to find a path to intelligent policy, I'm afraid.
You wrote a fascinating piece not long ago about the vindication of Benedict XVI's Regensburg lecture.
Right.
I want to put a little piece of that on screen, and I'd like you to comment. At one point, referencing a Byzantine emperor, he said, without descending to details, such as the indifference in treatment accorded to those who have the book and the infidels, he, the emperor, addresses his interlocutor with a startling brusqueness, a brusqueness that we find unacceptable on the central question about the relationship between religion and violence in general, saying, show me just what Muhammad brought that was new, and there you will find things only evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached. The emperor, after having expressed himself so forcefully, goes on to explain in detail the reasons why spreading the faith through violence is something unreasonable. What was the point of Benedict's lecture? What were the issues he was trying to engage the world on, and Islam particularly?
I suspect if Benedict XVI had to do it all over again, he would have gotten right to his argument without illustrating it with a, an interesting sideline from early medieval history, which then began to be obsessed upon by the world press, who then missed the argument. He was trying to raise 2 points and then make a proposal. The 2 questions were, can Islam find within its own religious resources warrants, arguments in favor of religious tolerance, including tolerance of those who change their religious location? And can Islam find within itself Islamic buttressing for the distinction between spiritual and political authority in a 21st century state? Then the Pope said, maybe this is something we could be of some modest assistance on, because it took the Catholic Church about 200 years to figure out from within its own resources, not by surrendering to political modernity, but from within Catholic resources, how to affirm religious freedom and how to affirm constitutional democracy. All of that has been comprehensively lost, but that's what the issues are. He exactly identified the 2 crucial questions both within Islam and between Islam and the rest.
I want to move forward a little bit.
Please.
Pope Francis said during his flight home from Korea recently, you can stop an aggressor, an unjust aggressor, but I didn't say you could do it with bombs. He also said one country shouldn't be making these decisions. It should be made by the community of countries. Your thoughts?
There is no community of countries, and I think it would be clarifying for all of us, including the senior officials of the Holy See, to stop using the phrase, the world community. That doesn't exist. To wait for the United Nations to do anything is, at least since the Korean War, to wait endlessly. The fact of the matter is, when there are outlaws loose in the world, as is clearly the case with ISIS, ISIL, the Caliphate, somebody's got to organize the posse. That somebody is almost certainly, in these kinds of instances, going to be the United States. Now, it doesn't mean we should do it alone. I think the principal threat that ISIS poses is to fellow Arabs throughout the Middle East. They should be doing the heavy lifting on this, but we've got to organize things. And that seems to me to stop murderous people from the mass slaughter of innocents. If that is not a justified use of armed force, I don't know what is. It's as simple as that.
Does it fit within the just war tradition, given it requires competent authority?
Yeah, the competent authority in this case are the people with the capacity and the will to deal with the evil. Moral competence does not, whatever the question of legal competence.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Moral
does it require
competence,
congressional approval to reach that threshold?
That's a prudential judgment, as is whether you go to the UN. But the notion that the legal competence of the UN includes an overwhelming or overweening or superseding moral competence, there is no way to make that argument, it seems to me, with real force, given the incapacities of that institution. I wish it were different, but it isn't. So therefore, moral competence has to rest elsewhere.
Do you think we have a moral responsibility, given that, though the United States is not responsible for ISIS's action, the situation, the dislocation of the Christian community, we are responsible in part.
We have a responsibility, Raymond, as the major power that stands for order, human rights, decency, fair dealing in world affairs. And we are the only major power that has the will to try to do something about that when things really get bad, since that will manifestly does not exist in Europe today, unfortunately, with a few exceptions. So yeah, I think we do have a responsibility, and I think it's incumbent upon the political leadership of the country to explain to the American people why we cannot revert to a kind of isolationism because the world simply won't allow it. It's not without interest that some of these fanatics who have been involved in the brutality in Syria and northern Iraq have come from the United States and come from Britain.
Yeah.
This is not simply homegrown over there.
Yeah.
This is another facet of this that needs to be looked at squarely.
Well, and today we just saw an Iraqi military post just overrun, 100 people slaughtered of these are Iraqi troops. So ISIS is on the move, it continues to grow. I want to shift from that battle in the Middle East to the battle now along the Tiber. Any day now we're going to begin this synod on the family. In the lead up to this, many months ago, Cardinal Walter Casper waived this proposal about that mercy was needed for those who are divorced and remarried, and that mercy included giving them communion, or finding a fast pass, if you will, to give them communion. Your thoughts on what this has, the narrative that this has created, because he's appeared on the cover of European magazines, captured the attention of the whole world's media, and there seems to be a narrative already in place before this synod ever started.
I think, as usual, or as is too frequently the case, the narrative and the reality don't cohere. And I hope that storyline, which which at least deals with a very serious pastoral problem, does not dominate this. Look, we all know that marriage culture throughout the Western world is in deep, deep crisis. We also know, or should know, as Catholics, that we have a very good proposal to make in the face of that. I hope this is a positive synod. This is my Catholic Press column next week called Wanted, a Positive Synod. I hope the synod begins by lifting up the beauty and dignity of Christian marriage as the answer to this crisis of marriage culture throughout the world. And I think some of the American bishops intend to do that. I know African bishops for whose people the discovery of Christian marriage has come as an enormous liberation from both ancient customs and the degradation of women within that, are going to be quite vocal on this. And I think it may well be said, at least behind the scenes, if not in public where everyone tries to be polite, that it is really not up to dying local churches in Europe, some of whom have 7% Mass attendance on Sunday, some of whom have 10% Mass attendance on Sunday, to pretend that they have a pastoral answer to the crisis of marriage culture when they manifestly don't have a pastoral answer to much else right now.
Do you remember a time, George, when we had this kind of, really since the council, when we had this kind of public expression of disagreement among cardinals in the public sphere, where they're writing books, and you've got Cardinal Burke and Pell and Mueller, the head of the CDF, writing a book to contradict what Casper is saying, and his repeated lengthy interviews as well as printed comments. Do you remember a time when we had quite this?
This went on all through the 70s and 80s when the subject was liberation theology. Look, there's nothing wrong with senior churchmen having brisk, intelligent arguments about serious issues. What I hope does not get lost in this, and let me complement what I just said about Europe with a statement about America. For all of the problems of the church in the United States, we have deployed better John Paul II's theology of the body than any church in the Western world. We have better marriage preparation programs than any church in the Western world. And we have evolved an approach to the problems of the divorced we have a more developed annulment process, if you will, than any place else in the world. That experience needs to be brought to bear at the Synod.
But there aren't a lot of those people and leaders in those areas, George, who are invited to this Synod.
This is a great disappointment, frankly. I think it's a shame that some extraordinarily bright American women, I think of Helen Alvarez, my colleague Mary Eberstadt, Anna Halpin of the World Youth Alliance, Mary Hassan, another Ethics and Public Policy Center colleague of mine. These are women with great competence in these areas who ought to have been part of the formal conversation. And perhaps when this agenda-setting Synod, and that's all this is.
This first part is.
This year,
next year.
When the real conversation gets going in earnest next year, some of them will be there.
One of our email correspondents was asking the question, the Pope, in authorizing this commission to streamline annulments, isn't he putting the cart before the horse? Well, I thought that's what they were discussing, they're saying.
Well, this is obviously part of the conversation. And if that gets located in this more positive context than I'm talking about, of the Church lifting up before the world the beauty and dignity of marriage understood as a covenant of love and fruitfulness for life, as the answer to this corrosive collapse of marriage culture that is destroying lives and is primarily destroying children's lives, or very heavily weighing on children, then all of this other tweaking of canonical process or whatever begins to fall into place.
It's not so important. Walter Casper is now, Cardinal Casper, beginning to make noises about contraception needs a relook, he's saying, and perhaps that should be part of the discussion at this Synod. Are you concerned that this Synod, as it's beginning, it hasn't even begun yet, and yet the public narrative, the Pope, when he married all those couples, and the press had to find the two couples, one who was cohabitating, the other who already had children, they used that as evidence that the Pope is interested in sort of remaking the notion of Catholic marriage and permanent marriage.
Pope has given absolutely no indication of that whatsoever. He discussed the attempt, he described the attempt to redefine marriage in Argentina when he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires as an attack of Satan. He is going to beatify Paul VI at the end of the Synod. So yes, the contraception question is coming up again, and Paul VI is going to be vindicated at the close of the Synod. I don't know whether Cardinal Casper hasn't gotten the invitation to the beatification ceremony yet. Look, the Catholic Church in John Paul II's Theology of the Body has the most compelling response to the degradation visited upon our culture by this sexual free fire zone in which we live of any institution in the world. I'm sorry that some people in the Church haven't caught on to this. That's of great sadness. But when I go to the 20 or 30 college campuses I visit every year, what do I find? I find young people organizing discussion groups around this challenging but very compelling material of John Paul II.
A quick call. She's on the line. Pam from Maryland. What's your question, Pam?
Hi. Yes, I would like to know, I heard the president talking at the UN and said that Islam is a peaceful religion.
Right.
And what does the Catholic, the Church believe?
What does the Church teach in this regard?
I think, Raymond and Pam, it's time to get this entire discussion out of sound bites. The sound bite, Islam is a religion of peace. The sound bite, we can't have boots on the ground. Badoop, badoop, badoop. All of this is cartoon-level stuff, not worthy of a great power. Islam is 1.1 billion people. That's a complex organism, part of humanity. And to deal with these things in these 5-word cartoon balloons is just not serious. I would suggest that people look at the section on Islam in John Paul II's interview book, Crossing the Threshold of Hope, which is very interesting. It expresses great respect for the piety of Muslims, the intensity of their prayer life, their commitment to charity, and then says, but we've got some issues here. There's a very different idea of God. There's a very different idea of the human person. There's a very different idea of the sacred text. And this all has got to be talked about in a serious, calm, adult way, not through sound bites.
Yeah, and there is this vein of fundamentalist, deadly Islam that is gaining adherents, and the young are listening to it. And I was told by someone, actually an Islamic scholar the other day, many of these people are illiterate who are being drawn to this, but they're taught a few lines from the Quran, and they live by that, and they repeat it, and they're very fervent.
Very distinguished Muslim scholar of the just war tradition said to me here in Washington 10 years ago at a conference on that subject, my biggest problem, he taught at a prestigious Northeastern university, my biggest problem is my students. My Muslim students who come from these madrasas that have been set up around the world, usually with Saudi funding, set up around the United States with Saudi funding, who have been taught a very narrow, aggressive form of this complex religious tradition. That was his biggest problem. So that, again, illustrates what I mean about the civil war within the Islamic world that then spills off into everything else.
George Weigel, thanks so much for the insight.
Raymond. Always good to be
for doing the
with you.
quick round robin here. George's books, Roman Pilgrimage, The Station Churches, and Evangelical Catholicism are available at bookstores everywhere, and they're both worthy reads. You can keep up with George Weigel's columns at National Review online at nationalreview.com. We told you about the Pew survey. A majority now believe religion is on the wane. Now, a former skeptic has decided to examine the evidence for Christianity. Author of Jesus on Trial, David LIMBAUGH joins us when The World Over Live continues. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. Is the Old Testament a collection of myths? Are the gospel accounts of Jesus just pious fabrications? There are many who think so. My next guest was a skeptic who set out to prove that the Gospels are actually evidence of the real historical figure, Jesus Christ. He turned his lawyerly eye on the Scriptures and history to consider the available evidence for Christianity. He's a political commentator, a former professor of law, and the author of the new book, Jesus on Trial, A Lawyer Affirms the Truth of the Gospel. Please welcome to the program, David LIMBAUGH.
Raymond,
great to have you here. Now, you were raised, you and your brother Rush, were raised in a Christian household. What was the denomination? What did you?
We were Methodists, and it was a great church, Centenary Methodist Church, and we went every Sunday. Didn't particularly like going.
What happened? Why did you drift away?
I don't think the message ever took with me. I mean, I thought it did. I never, by the way, doubted that God existed. You can look out and see the glory of His creation, Romans 1:19 and 20, and know for sure. And I think the people that deny that are covering something up. I think subconsciously we all know. But I didn't buy into the deity of Jesus Christ or the entire salvation scheme and of the triune God of the Bible.
In the book, you really go at this piece by piece, and you present the conflicts, the contradictory seeming moments in the Scriptures. Yet, if I can play devil's advocate for a moment, people will come to this, and some might say, wait a minute, you're trying to use the thing itself, the Bible, to prove the validity of the Bible. How do you do that?
It's interesting. Well, two ways, and I want to approach this from two different paths that I think converge. There are different types of Christian apologetics. There's presuppositional apologetics, which I think is more, the Bible is its own proof. And the classical apologetics, which goes into the historicity of the gospel and all that. I tried to show both things. Now, not really, I didn't call it presuppositional, but my spiritual journey was reflected in the first chapter, but it also, I structured the book to reflect my spiritual journey, because what really got me was the Bible itself. I think the Bible promises to have the power of conversion, and it does. And why you say, why did I what was your question?
Well, why did you decide to use the Bible to prove itself?
The circular reasoning. There's an argument, and one of my skeptical friends said, now don't put a bunch of Bible stuff in here. Those of us that are skeptics, we atheists, we agnostics, we don't have a high view of the Bible. If you put that in there, it won't impress us. And I said, Steve, if I gut the Bible from here, I will have gutted half the book, because the Bible to me is such an attractive body of truth. And the Bible convicted me. The prophecies, the integrity between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I disagree with the proposition that demonstrating that getting things from the Bible is circular reasoning, because you first examine the reliability of the Bible by looking at textual criticism. Let me just touch on this. The New Testament has more copies of manuscripts that are in existence than any other ancient book, by far. Most ancient manuscripts, there are 10 to 20 copies. The New Testament, there are 25-some thousand. Now, the only ancient manuscript that comes close is the Iliad by Homer, 1800, some 7%. Now, that's significant not because it shows how it was preserved by the scribes, but because when you have more manuscripts, it allows the textual critics to compare and then determine what the original was. We know that the Bible came down to us as it was originally written. Just some minor variants that are not substantive. Old Testament too.
We have some emails which I want to get to in a minute, but I have a few questions first. You mentioned early on in the book someone who's very dear to me, Archbishop Fulton Sheen, his Life of Christ. How did you come upon that, and why Sheen? You say he's one of your favorites.
Yes, because I was a seeker. I think the Holy Spirit obviously was pursuing me, and all of us, but I was a seeker. I wanted to play for the right team. That is Christianity. I'm not talking about Catholicism versus Protestant. And I just, I looked at different bookstores and I found that, and I wanted to find out about Christ, and it was the Life of Christ, or Life of Christ. And he said three things that totally changed my perspective on Christianity. Jesus was the only man who claimed to be God that was pre-announced. A lot of people have claimed to be God, still do. He was the only one prophesied and fulfilled that prophecy. The second thing, he's the only guy that ever split history in half, BC and AD. Powerful. But the most significant, the one I get goosebumps talking about, is that he is the only man that ever lived life backward. The cross is why he came to live, and it casts a shadow backward on his life.
Suffering, pain and suffering was certainly a big theme for Sheen in that book.
Yes.
It was a big stumbling block for you.
Yes.
Why?
Why would an all-powerful, all-loving God permit this type of evil that we see every day? Now, the way I resolve that, one thing that leads me back to the faith, when we have doubts tugging at us, one thing that ironically grabs me back away from doubt is the pervasiveness of evil in society, which to me confirms the authenticity of the biblical worldview, which accurately describes the human condition like nothing else. Then there's other arguments for evil. That's not the argument for evil, which we could go into if you asked me.
Sure. But I want to get one question in from the viewer, and then I want to throw a few in. One of them asked here, why should I believe this Bible? Aren't these just oral accounts written decades after the events? And couldn't you backwrite them, if you will, to comply and fit with the earlier prophecies?
Well, no, you couldn't. Jesus riding in on the donkey, yes. He could have fabricated those and manufactured those events. But these events were written by eyewitnesses and close associates of eyewitnesses within close proximity of the events they recorded. Jesus' life between 29 and 33 A.D., the gospel accounts written between 50 and 60 A.D., and John perhaps 90 A.D. And then we have the first extant manuscript within 250 years of the events, of the first writings. But the significant thing about this is, and it would take a lot longer interview to go into the intricacies of this, but consider this. The gospel writers, when Jesus died, were feckless, I don't want to say cowards, but they were dispirited, dejected. But when he appeared to them in his bodily resurrection 3 days after he died, over a period of 40 days, 12 different times, at one point to 500 people, when Paul wrote about it in 1 Corinthians, he said, and he challenged many of these people, it was just 20 years before, were still alive, they could have contradicted him. There's no evidence that anyone contradicted him. But here's the main pivotal point. These people didn't come up with a theology around which to go and spread the gospel. They didn't believe significantly. They weren't convinced. Jesus reappeared to them. Then they were transformed into bold proclaimants of the gospel. Why? Not because they came up with a theology that sounded good. You can find other people who, for example, Jim Jones, they will die for their leaders.
Right.
What's the difference? Gary Habermas, New Testament scholar, says the difference is they had witnessed Jesus in the flesh. It's like the difference between believing an abstract set of ideas versus seeing a friend last week. They saw him, then they were willing to die. If they hadn't seen him, do you think they would have died for something they knew to be a lie? People who follow Jim Jones didn't know it was a lie. They knew Jesus was resurrected.
There's a question here, Joy from Toronto, and she's asking, why does God hide himself from some? She's read your book already, she says.
Well, that's something that always bothered me. If God's here, why doesn't he just tell us, like Dorothy, the Wicked Witch of the West, right? Surrender Dorothy and Black Smoke. Yeah. And I always wondered, well, then it occurred to me, he did. He reveals himself generally in nature and in the creation. And then he sent his son to die for us at a certain point in human history, and we've got complete corroborative historical truth that it occurred. But we also have the Bible, which is way more content-rich than Surrender Dorothy. It's something that's enduring. We have it with us every day. When it finally dawned on me that the Bible was the inspired, inerrant Word of God, it blew me away, because I knew when I read biblical prophecy that prophesying that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem, Micah 5:2, specific predictions about his passion, about his crucifixion in Isaiah 53 and Psalms 22, I knew it was the only way I could have denied it is if I would have concocted a story that it was written after the fact, as a lot of liberal scholars have done, but they have to stretch it. It was written by one Isaiah in 700 BC or more, or later.
Tell me, did you, when in working on the book, in exploring this, which doesn't seem something you did for a short amount of time, this went on and on. Did you go to the Holy Land? Did you look into
No, I did not do that. But I have Logos Bible software. They got a Catholic version, by the way. Have you seen that? And it is awesome. I have almost 12,000 books on there, and they're all searchable. This is not a promo for Logos, but I mean, I really researched this stuff, and I have on and off for 20 years. It's been fascinating to me. This wasn't just something that I did when I wrote the book. This was a reflection, a record of what I had learned, although you learn a lot more and you reaffirm as you go. By the way, this book isn't just for skeptics. It's for believers who need their faith reaffirmed from time to time. We fall away, we backslide. We need to exercise the spiritual disciplines to stay in it.
Talk to me before we run out of time. The history of the making of the Bible, this is always a quarrelsome point. People say, wait a minute, this didn't drop from the sky. This was the creation of multiple authors. It was part of an oral tradition, condensed down, and then you had these councils that, you know, of church fathers who said, that's in, the book of Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas is out. So we really are relying on their credibility and authority, through all of this.
But that, to me, another paradox, that's what makes me believe in it more, the unity in the diversity. It was written over a 1,500-year period by 40 different authors, 66 books, different geographical locations, and they didn't know each other, but a few of them. And yet it all comes down the same theology, God's nature revealed consistently throughout. I was reading, the first time I was exposed to a reference Bible, and you see the interconnectedness, and it's consistent throughout. But the thing is, there was not competing Christologies in the early going, as the Da Vinci Code suggests. Jesus' deity was well accepted by all the gospel writers. In fact, Pliny the Younger, a secular, wrote to the Roman Emperor Trajan, the Christians are causing trouble. They're singing hymns to Christ as if to a God. We're talking about deity. So I trust the early authorities to have ferreted out, not because they made some decision and debates at these councils. They were affirming what had already been accepted by tradition as canonical. Now, again, there's a difference between Catholic and Protestant, but I'm talking about the main thrust of it we agree on.
No, it all hangs together.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is all these councils. I mean, I think when you start looking back at the history, Certainly, many of my evangelical friends and I have found a lot more that unites us than divides us.
Absolutely.
Because we're kind of in the Bible business together.
Absolutely, but there was no debate about, in the main church fathers, about the Trinity and all that.
No.
But there were some
there
heresies.
was, but it was settled.
Well, yes,
Yeah.
it was settled. Yeah, they're minority views, but Gnosticism didn't come until later. Jesus was not a ghost. They didn't have a disdain for the material world. Jesus said, be in the world, not of it, but God created everything in the world and it was good. And the heresy is to suggest that he was just God and not human. He's fully human and fully God. Fulton Sheen, that's another insight.
Great. David Limbaugh, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure. David's book, Jesus on Trial, A Lawyer Affirms the Truth of the Gospel, is available at bookstores everywhere and online. You can find more about David and read his columns at davidlimbaugh.com. Coming up, we have long reported on the persecution of Christians in the Middle East. My next guest, a simple priest, has begun a new initiative to raise awareness and support. Father Benedict Kiely joins us when The World Over Live returns. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. What the Christians of Iraq and Syria have endured at the hands of ISIS over the last few months has stunned the world. My next guest is a parish priest from Vermont. He and his parishioners decided to do something proactive about the suffering of the Christians there. I sat down with him recently here in D.C. to discuss his new initiative. Here's my interview with pastor of Blessed Sacrament Church in Stowe, Vermont, Father Benedict Kiely. Father Benedict, I want to start with these items. First of all, you've come up with a number of reminders, really, of the Christian persecution and the Christians in Iraq being persecuted. Tell us why these items, where did this whole idea originate?
Well, Raymond, it started because people say, what can I do? People feel so helpless. It actually started for me just 6 weeks ago when Mosul fell. I was walking, praying, and said those very words, what can I do, what can we do? And the thought came, something simple, something easy, something cheap that can actually help. And so I thought everyone is wearing these rubber bracelets, they wear lapel pins, we can produce these and the money can go directly to the Christians in need.
I was about to ask, how does a priest, an Englishman stationed in Stowe, Vermont, come up with this idea and have this burden, if you will, placed on his heart?
Well, as you know, stealing your motto from your program, Things Seen and Unseen, we've known for many years the unseen persecution of the Christians. And Cardinal Wuerl recently asked, why the silence? Again, we know why the silence is, because Christians have not mattered. Now it's seen, it's visible. You can't ignore genocide, you can't ignore babies being cut in half, you can't ignore crucifixion. And so one has to respond in some way. And people always say, well, how will my money be safe? How can I be ensured that it will get? And we're using a charity that will get it to the boots on the ground.
Where do the funds go? Because the idea is people will call in and they can order these, or they get these with a donation.
Last night, the Feast of Our Lady of Ransom, the great ancient feast in the church, ransoming the Moor slaves. The website was launched. You'll buy the items just like on Amazon, and then all the money, all the profits will go directly to aid to the Church in Need, which is an old charity started after the Second World War, which has boots on the ground. And tell us why these items. Do you see these also as signs of solidarity with the community? Exactly. That's the exact. I have three sort of reasons. The first was solidarity. You're wearing it in support. It's also a conversation starter. People will ask. I was at the dentist the other day, and the lady said, "What's that funny sign on your lapel?" So one can explain. She said, "Are you a Muslim?" I said, "The exact opposite." And then you explain the story. Second is prayer. Our Holy Father, Pope Francis, has asked us to pray. People often say prayer is a last resort. Prayer is a first resort. And then the third is charity, because the money will go to help. So simple things, zipper pulls we're going to have in a few weeks' time, bracelets, lapel pins, they're easy. You pray, you show solidarity, and you give.
And this is, of course, the N
in Arabic that was written on the doors of all the Christians?
It's written on the doors. It's a sign, as the Nazis used the Star of David to identify Jews, the ISIS and the other extremists are painting the houses, which of course means that the people in the houses will probably be killed unless they leave. So it's, in a way, it's almost like the cross, a terrible sign which can be redeemed by our wearing it.
Father Benedict Kiely, thank you so much for being here. The website is Nazarean, NASAREAN.org, and you can find the pins, these great bracelets, and so many other items there. And I love the idea that it's not only something that shows solidarity, but it goes directly to those Christians in need.
Well, thank you for your work, Raymond.
Thank you, Father.
Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Now, don't miss next week's show. I'll be talking with author and columnist Jennifer Fulwiler about her journey from atheism to faith and how she found real happiness, plus an encore of my hilarious interview with comic legend Tim Conway. In the meantime, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. We'll see you next time. Bye now.